and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre Viskontas. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. As the impact of climate change on our lives grows more and more obvious, more and more of us are working hard to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and our carbon emissions. In our household, we've installed solar panels, we've replaced gas appliances with electric ones, we use our bikes to get around as much as possible, and I have to say, most days I feel pretty virtuous. But apparently it's a false virtue, and it's one that I've been thinking about a lot over the last year or so. Because if I just consider for a minute all of the electronics that we have in our home, whether they're the ones that are powering our dryer or our bikes or our phones and devices, well, the tally of precious metals within them begins to add up pretty quickly. And of course, we recycle a lot of these electronics every few years. So if you start taking into account the environmental cost of building a car, for example, that's electric and has a massive battery, and then you power that battery using large solar panels, I start to wonder whether the calculation really adds up in Mother Nature's favor, or if I'm contributing or creating a problem where one didn't previously exist. I live in San Francisco too, and I cheer on the AI boom that is bringing my beloved city back to life, populating abandoned buildings near our empty downtown core. But I worry about the ethics. Should I also be worried about the environmental impact of the proliferation of AI? I think the answer is most certainly yes, in addition to the economic impacts. So let's get some facts straight about the electro-digital AI revolution that we're in the midst of so we can make decisions that are, in fact, aligned with our values. Joining me today is Vince Beiser. He's an award-winning journalist and author whose work has appeared in Wired, The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The New York Times. And his new book, Power Metal: The Race for Resources That Will Shape the Future, gives us an inside look into how our shift to electronics is affecting our world. Vince, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
Thanks, Indre. It's great to be here. That was a great introduction, by the way.
Great. Well, I have to say I was almost late for our interview this morning because I'm in, I try to wait as long as possible before getting a new iPhone. And my current iPhone was starting to do things that really were not sustainable. Like it would just freeze and then I'd have to wait for its battery to go away before I could do anything. And since I use it for work and, all kinds of household things, I kind of needed a new one. And so I was, replacing it. And of course, it took forever. And I felt pretty good about it because I got this deal where I could replace, I could send the old one back. And I'm thinking, well, that's great for the environment. I'm not like leaving any kind of a trace by doing this swap. But apparently that's not true. So let's take let's start with these devices. How effective is the recycling of the metals in these devices? And how much should we be worrying about the fact that we continue to buy more and more devices every few years?
Okay, well, let me start with the second part of your question first. How concerned should we be? Quite concerned, yeah. It's a big problem. So when we're talking about recycling all the digital gadgets that we all love so much, our phones, our laptops, Xbox controllers, whatever, there's two problems that we're up against. One is most of those things never get recycled at all, right? Most people, like you're a very conscientious person. Bravo, Indra.
Well, they gave me a bunch of money. They gave me like a whole bunch of money off the new phone, right? So that's a huge incentive.
That's great. That's great. Listen, whatever it takes. But, and those kind of, I think we're starting to see more of those kinds of programs. But at the moment, the reality is most e-waste, most of our electronic gadgets, when they die, they don't get recycled at all. We just stick them in a junk drawer and forget about them. Like pretty much everybody's got a drawer full of old cables and old adapters and old plugs, or we just toss them, right? We just throw them out with the rest of the garbage. So, I mean, in the US, only about 1 out of every 6 mobile phones gets recycled, is the
Wow.
best estimate. Yeah. So that's problem number one, is that most of it never even ends up in the recycling stream. The second part is, let me be clear, recycling is better. Like, it's better to recycle a thing than to throw it out. It's better recycling is easier on the planet than digging up fresh virgin raw materials to build a whole new iPhone. But it is not cost free. I mean, that's sort of the theme that I kept returning to with on this book. And kind of the biggest lesson for me is there are no perfect solutions, right? There's only everything we do has costs. Everything we do has trade-offs. So again, recycling is a good thing to do. It's better, but recycling is also very energy intensive. It has lots of carbon, entails lots of carbon emissions of its own. It's often very polluting, right? Recycling happens in big, smoke spewing smelters that generate lots of pollution that gets out into the atmosphere. And third, it's also often done on the backs of some of the poorest people in the world, right? A lot of times where our electronics end up is in places like Lagos, Nigeria, where I went and did some reporting for this book. And I spent time with e-waste recyclers there. And what happens is very often our electronics they get passed from hand to hand to hand, and they get shipped overseas in gigantic diesel burning container ships. And they wind up in scrap yards in places like Lagos, where there's people working in the most appalling conditions you can imagine, just cracking open old cell phones with screwdrivers and hammers, pulling out the little bits of metal that are valuable, selling those to recyclers, which will then be put on another ship, sent off to China or to Belgium or somewhere like that. Meanwhile, the rest of the stuff that phone in gets tossed or gets burned in incredibly toxic, polluting fires. So you put it all together, still on balance, better than building a new phone from scratch. But we have to understand it is not a cost-free proposition. There is still damage that happens when you recycle anything.
One of my favorite chapters in your book was when you described the guys who started iFixit. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this whole. I think a lot of people who use Apple products have been aware of this history of them making it very difficult, actually, to go in and fix your own Apple products. And then there was the scandal of, Apple slowing down, older phones, etc. So, I mean, it seems like that would be a better direction to go in. And so tell us about that history and how it all started.
That is a way better direction to go in. Basically, the idea is I sort of put iFixit under the category of reuse, because really, the main solutions are summed up in that old slogan that's been around since the 70s: reduce, reuse, recycle. And we tend to think about recycling first. That's sort of the solution that pops into everybody's heads foremost. Everybody loves the idea of recycling. But in fact, recycling is the worst way to get more use out of any given product. It's much more efficient, much easier on the planet to keep using that product, to extend the life of that product. And that's what the iFixit guys are all about. Those guys are absolute heroes in my book. So in a nutshell, for your viewers who don't know, it's an outfit that was started by a guy named Kyle Wiens, to first of all just to make it easier to repair your own stuff. So they post thousands and thousands of DIY guides to how to repair anything from your cordless vacuum to your electric drill to your MacBook, because they realized that it's a deliberate corporate strategy to make these things difficult to repair so that you're incentivized to buy a new one. So they've been doing that for a while. And then more recently, they've sort of joined up with this, what's called the right to repair movement, which is a big push. It's happening around the country. And in fact, in lots of places around the world, to basically force manufacturers to make their gadgets easier to repair. So the way that Apple and other electronics makers have done this is, historically, they don't make spare parts available. They don't make the information available. You can't get a hold of the manuals that would show you how to fix your broken gadget. Sometimes even the tools that you need, you can't even get. Like, I'm talking to you on a MacBook. You can't open this MacBook with a regular screwdriver. You need a special Apple specific screwdriver to open this thing. So in a nutshell, what they've done is they've been pushing for laws to basically force manufacturers to make their things easier to repair. And amazingly, after years and years of trying and getting shot down in state after state after state, just in the last year or two, they've finally started to notch up some victories. So Massachusetts, California, where you are, Colorado, a couple of other states have passed laws that basically do that, that force manufacturers to make it easier to repair their stuff. And the really good news is that manufacturers have finally started to see the light and have actually switched. So like Apple is the most famous example. They fought tooth and nail against these initiatives for years, but they finally flipped and they finally kind of realized like this is not in their best interests. And so that California bill that just passed, I think just maybe earlier this year, anyway, within the last year, Apple actually supported it. And now they're doing more things. They're sort of coming on board more with the idea of repairing and also recycling, which is great. We need much, much more of that.
I mean, I like to think that they're doing that because it's better for the planet, but I'm sure there's a corporate reason, as people want to feel better about their brand, and this brand has a previous problem that they're trying to fix, then now they're kind of going in the other direction. But I was really surprised. And as I mentioned, I upgraded my phone, that sounds actually rosier because, of course, it's a branding thing. I switched out my phone for the latest version because the other phone wasn't working as well. And, I got this big rebate, right? And of course they make it sound like, oh, you're saving $1,000, even you're not really, right? You're giving them, but it makes you feel as though, well, if they're going to pay me $1,000 to send me my old phone, surely they must be using my phone. So
Yes.
is it true that they are actually, is there any way that these companies are benefiting from the actual receipt of these old materials? Because as you described it, it sounds like the cost of recycling it is going to far outweigh the tiny amount of money that they could maybe gain from reusing some of these materials.
Right, for sure. So I don't know about the inner workings of Apple's recycling program, but very good chance what they're doing is reselling that phone, probably to somewhere in a developing country. So we here in America or in Canada where I live, most folks are like, oh, there's a new iPhone out this year. I'll junk my old one and get the brand new one, right? It's like, ooh, what's in fashion this year? All over the world, there are loads of people who are perfectly happy to use, millions and millions of people who are delighted to get an iPhone 7 or 8 or 10, right? And there's a huge market for that. There's a little bit of a market here in the US. Like I've got an iPhone 12 that I just got like a month or two ago. I got it from eBay. It was refurbished. So that it does happen a bit here, but it's where it really happens on a massive scale is in the developing world. So lots of these phones get sold overseas for reuse, which is fine. I mean, that's great as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I also talked to some folks who are in that business while I was in Lagos, where there's this thriving industry of folks importing old, still working old electronics, laptops, cell phones, you name it, and reselling them, which is great. It means those things are being reused, right? The life of that thing is getting extended, which again is way better than building a new one from scratch, also better than recycling it. You can also if you really want to get into it, the more efficient, before you get to recycling, what'll happen a lot of times is they'll open up your phone and take out components, right? Like the chips that you can break off the actual chips on them and sell those to refurbishers who will use them in new or refurbished phones. The cameras too, that little bitty lens on the back of your phone, you can take that thing out and there's a little metal foil that's attached to it and resell that. So there's a lot of money to be made in sort of parting out your old electronics, which again is something that happens way more in the developing world. So it just goes to show you there's a lot of value in these things that we are not capturing, that the world is throwing away. In fact, the UN reckons just by throwing out so much electronics, we are wasting about $60 billion worth of materials. So it's not only an environmental problem, it's also just a huge waste of resources and money, right? There's money to be made.
Yeah. When I think about the shift to electric cars, there needs to be, I mean, right now the electric cars are still vastly outnumbered by gas and diesel powered vehicles, right? So we need more electric cars if everyone's going to drive an electric car, right? I'm not saying that we need more cars in general. I think we need fewer, but if we're going to replace all of these gas powered cars as opposed to just reducing, we're going to need to build more electric cars. And so I get that then you're going to have to go and get these metals, out of the earth. And I want to talk about that too, so that people get a sense of that environmental cost. But I don't think we ever need to make another phone from scratch again. Like, there's probably more than enough phones out there for every human to have several, I imagine. If people are we're every couple years getting a new phone, and people have had cell phones for 10, 20 years. And yet I get the sense that we're not even close to being at that place. And we're still mining for the metals, even in our electronic devices. So what do you see as is there going to be a tipping point where at some point we actually will no longer we'll just be able to reuse the components, as you say, in these phones? Or is it just, well, there's this push to always, have something new, and every time you have something new, you need to manufacture it from scratch with new materials? In your head, how do you weigh those two possibilities?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, of course, that's the great hope, right? That's the circular economy dream, is that we won't need, that everything will just be reused and recycled again and again endlessly. Um, I dream that dream. I don't think it's realistic. I mean, we can certainly get a lot closer to that than we are now, much closer to it. But we're never going to get to a place where we're just reusing, where we're doing nothing but recycling. There's a few reasons for that. One is, there's already billions of phones in circulation. There's something like 5.3 billion phones that are sold every single year, right? So there's almost as many as there are people. But so part of the challenge is, at the moment, one of the big challenges is it's actually often cheaper to mine fresh materials than it is to recycle them, right? So eventually everything gets recycled, right? You reuse stuff. But eventually that thing breaks down to a point where you can't refurbish it enough. And then hopefully it gets recycled. That's what should happen at the end of its life. That's good. But again, it's actually cheaper at the moment to dig up virgin materials. So there's a real sort of market imbalance there. The other thing is, technology is constantly changing, right? So right now you can take a chip off of an iPhone 12 and stick it in a refurbished iPhone 14, maybe. But the chip on an iPhone 3, I mean, I'm just making up these examples, but point is, a 10-year-old chip, a camera, certain components, at a certain point, they're just not going to work anymore. They're going to be the equivalent of old vacuum tubes or something. They're just going to be useless, and they're going to have to be junked. So there's a limit to how reusable things are, and then there's also a limit to how recyclable things are, because some of the materials that are in our phones are extremely difficult to recycle. Stuff like copper, and there's gold inside your phone. That stuff's pretty easy, right? We know we've got the technology for that. There's big demand for it. Some of the things there's such tiny, tiny amounts of them that it's almost impossible to recycle them at scale, at any kind of scale that makes sense. There's a group of elements called rare earth metals. There's 17 of these weird, obscure little metals that do hyper-specific things in your phone. There's a metal called europium, which is what makes you see red in your iPhone screen. No europium, no red on your screen. But it's little tiny, tiny flecks of europium that's in that screen. How do you pull out those little itty bitty flecks and get enough of them together to make it worth anybody's time to do that? Nobody's figured that out. And I suspect they probably never will. So for some things, we are probably going to have to keep producing, we're probably going to have to keep mining more materials indefinitely. But this comes back to what I was saying before, right? it's a fantasy to think that we can ever get to a point where we human beings are doing zero damage to the earth, where we're having zero impact. It's never going to happen, right? We are always, everything has costs, everything has downsides. We have to, that's number one. We just have to accept that that's a fact, and then just figure out, well, how can we minimize that impact? How can we bring that damage down to the absolute lowest level?
Yeah, I mean, so there are two things that made me think. One is there an industry in which people are trying to find ways to, simulate the effect of europium on your screen with a more easily accessible metal or resource? Is my first question, and the second one is, it is then like, obviously we're going to get to a point where like we're going to run out of all of these metals. So are people thinking about, so I mean, I guess it's sort of related to the first question, which is like, how do we create an iPhone, for example, that doesn't rely on all of these rare earth and other metals?
Yeah, well, I think the answer is, understand, accept, take the guilt onto our conscience consciences. Our lives, you, me, our lovely digital technology, our clothes, our car, everything. There's a certain amount of harm to the environment that comes with that. We're never going to get away from that. That said, we need to bring it down, like I said. So how can we do that? How can we bring that to the lowest possible level? So yeah, you're right. There is some research going on into alternatives. How can we find, better, less harmful, less damaging alternative materials, or ways to get those materials? There's a lot of research going on around that, and it brings us right back to reuse and recycling. Those are really important ways that we can do that. There's alternative chemistries like batteries. So the biggest consumer of all these metals that we're talking about, lithium, cobalt, nickel, are batteries. That's the lithium ion batteries in our phones, in our laptops, and also in our cars. They rely on lithium, cobalt, and nickel, three metals that are really causing a hell of a lot of problems all over the world. We are cutting rainforests to the ground in Indonesia to get nickel, where children are working in mines to harvest cobalt that goes into our batteries. A unique desert ecosystem is being endangered in Chile to get the lithium that we want. Big problems with lithium ion batteries. So one piece of good news is there are many other types of batteries. The most promising one is what are called lithium phosphate batteries, which, in a nutshell, instead of cobalt and nickel, they use iron and phosphates, which are two elements there's much more of them. They're much easier to get a hold of in a lot of ways. And in China, almost half of all the new electric cars coming out now have those kind of batteries, lithium phosphate batteries. So people don't want them at all in this country because they're not quite as energy dense. So they don't perform as well. They don't get you quite as far on a charge. They've gotten absolutely nowhere outside of China yet, but I think that's going to change. So that's one thing. Yes, we can substitute other technologies, other materials to a certain extent. But the most important thing, if we're really concerned about these issues, is the first part of that slogan: reduce, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. That's the order we should be thinking in. Recycling, good, but not nearly as good as reusing. Reusing, good, but not nearly as good as reducing. So the number one thing that we can all do, if you're really concerned about these issues, is just consume less stuff. Just don't even buy that car in the first place, right? So we've been talking a lot about electronics, consumer electronics, which are really important. But I got to tell you, Indra, they are dwarfed. The amount of metals that goes into making consumer electronics is a tiny fraction of what goes into making electric cars. It's really electric vehicles that are the number one that are the number one consumer. That's where most of the demand for all these metals is. So listen, electric cars, way better than gas-powered cars. If you must buy a car, definitely make it an electric car, but much better for the planet, for your own, for exploited people around the world. And really, I would argue for your own life, you're way better off if you can organize your life in such a way or help to get your city set up in such a way that you don't need a car, not even an electric one. I'll give you a real life example. So I used to live in Los Angeles, right, with my wife and our two kids. And in LA, of course, we had two cars, two grown-ups, two cars. We needed them, right? We had to have them to get around. We moved back to my hometown of Vancouver, Canada, about 4 years ago. And right away, we were able to ditch one of those cars. Now, we still have the two kids, we still have the dog, we still got, busy lives, but we only have one car. We only need one car. Why? Because Vancouver has actually put a lot of energy and effort in the last 20 years or so into making it easier to live life without a car. So they've built a really great bicycle network all over the city so you can ride easily and safely to just about anywhere in the city. There's a pretty decent public transit system. There's like a lot of streets that have been re-engineered to make them more walkable, to like reduce the number of cars so you're safer. There's walking around. There's a really great car sharing system. Right? Of course, we have Uber and Lyft and all that stuff, but there's also like a car share system where you can use an app and just find yourself a car. And I got to tell you, it's great, right? Like not only is it, does it salve my liberal conscience not having one less car, but it's way cheaper, man. I don't have to worry about the insurance and the repairs and the parking for that car. It's just like it's one huge source of stress that's an expense taken right out of my life. And that's the model we should be working on, right? They're doing a lot of that in San Francisco. New York City is making a lot of good moves in this direction. All over Western Europe, London, Paris, Seville. That is the one, as individuals, that is the number one thing you can do to reduce your consumption of these critical metals, of energy, of everything, is if you can, don't buy a car.
I think next time we're in Vancouver, we have family there. You're going to have to go on a bike ride with my husband, who you're speaking his language. He's been trying to convince me not to replace our car, which is now 10 years old, with another car because we bike everywhere. And I totally hear his argument and your argument, and it is true. We like barely use the car. We're always biking everywhere. And then I look to some of these trends in the US where people are moving out of places like California, which is very bike friendly because the weather is great all the time. And, to places like Texas and Florida and elsewhere where you could argue the weather is great, but there's much more of an emphasis on car culture because of the way things are built. So these big suburban sprawls that are very far away from, either cultural centers or grocery stores, et cetera. And while I think that you're right in terms of what's happening in these cities, Paris, San Francisco, Vancouver, and there is like a real recognition that this can be life-changing, it seems like as a whole, our country, the US at least, is shifting more towards a model of, back into this like single family home in the suburbs. And so it makes me very sad to think about the fact that we're very far away culturally from what you're describing. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, how do you get this message to people who are saying, look, I was priced out of living in cities because they've become unaffordable. I can't afford to live there. So I need to move far away from the city core. And as a result, I can't bike everywhere. I have to drive.
Yeah, that's a really good and a heavy question. I think, for a lot of places in the US, it's too late, right? If you live in Houston, if you live in Phoenix, you got to have a car, right? And those cities are so huge and they're so sprawling. I think they're almost a lost cause. But where we can make a difference, so there's a number of things we can do. So first of all, let's stop building cities that way, right? Let's instead, like, wherever there are new housing developments coming up, let's concentrate on making them more accessible to public transit, more accessible to bikes, which is happening to some extent, even in Los Angeles, where I used to live, right? do have a subway in Los Angeles. Most people don't even know that, but there is a pretty decent subway there. And they're doing a lot to build up housing around those subway stations, right? So you've got these like high-rise condominiums and apartment buildings that are all clustered around subway stations to make it easier. That's a good thing. If you're going to build a new, suburban housing development, I would say it should be incentivized. Government basically needs to incentivize, use tax breaks, whatever, to get those things built near to public transit, to build in, to make it bicycle accessible to public transit, or make it easy to at least drive to where you can catch a train or a subway or whatever. It's a hard sell in the United States, right? The United States is the car happiest place on the planet. The good news, one piece of good news is the rest of the world is very different, right? It's so, we're so insular in a lot of ways here in North America. And we tend to think of we can't change anything here. And this is the way that it is, but it's not like this in most of the world. Like the amount of car ownership is much higher in the US and in Canada than it is all over Western Europe and definitely all over the developing world. So, I have some hope for the US, not all that much. Where I really have hope for is in the developing world. That's where the growth is really happening. And that's where people are streaming into, Lagos, Beijing, Delhi, Jakarta. These are places that are still being built. And I really hope, and I think it's possible to avoid the mistakes that we've made here in the States. And you can see, there is a lot of momentum happening in the opposite direction. And there are a lot of examples that show you that it's possible, right? Like Amsterdam. In the 70s, Amsterdam was a city a lot like any other big city. It was full of cars. Most people got around by cars. They got sick of it. There was a big pushback against it. And basically for the last 50 years, they've been sort of rolling back car ownership, making it easier to bike and all the things we've been talking about. Now, if you go to Amsterdam, I was just there a couple of years ago. Oh my God, it blows my mind. You land in the airport, you take a subway, there's a fast train that takes you right to the center of town. You get out of that train station, the first thing you see is an enormous bicycle parking structure, thousands and thousands of bicycles stacked up in this thing. And this isn't just groovy liberals like you and me concerned, no, it's everybody. It's businessmen, it's old grannies, it's kids. Everybody's getting around by bike just because it's easy and it's safer. So now in Amsterdam, only 1 out of every 2 trips is taken by bicycle, which is almost the reverse of what it was 50 years ago. So there's, it's easier in Amsterdam than a lot of other places, but it just goes to show you it is not impossible. It can be done. And, like I say, we're never going to get rid of cars altogether, nor should we, right? I mean, cars are fine, right? Cars are great in lots of ways. They enable people to get around in ways that they couldn't. Cars are not the problem in and of themselves. It's the number of cars that's the problem. That's what we've got to bring down.
So I want to talk a little bit about the way that we can extract these metals from the earth. We haven't really touched on that, and that's a big part of your book. You mentioned the cobalt mines and the nickel, and what about under the sea? So I know that's another big area that people are saying, I think it's sort of akin to looking for oil, right? Drilling in Alaska and elsewhere. And I wonder, is there a kind of untapped resource that really, is in some ways where we should be looking, or are we just continuing to create these massive holes in our world that just is not going to be sustainable over the next several decades? Where are we in terms of where are the places where people are extracting these metals, and is there any hope for the future that we might find a more environmentally friendly way of extracting them?
Yeah, I think the answer to that last part is yes. That's some good news. So talk about deep sea mining really briefly. The resource is there. I mean, there are billions of these little rocks called polymetallic nodules at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and in a few other places that are chock full of cobalt, nickel, copper, magnesium, a bunch of the metals we need. They're definitely there. There's no question about that. The question is, how badly are we going to damage the oceans if we start strip mining the ocean floor?
Mm-hmm.
And for my money, if we wreck the oceans, we're cooked, right? Like that's the end of life on Earth. And the oceans are already super stressed from climate change, from overfishing, from pollution. They're already in rough shape. So for my money, and for you ask me, and if you ask hundreds and hundreds of, basically if you ask pretty much any marine scientist that isn't directly connected to the sea mining industry, they will all tell you this is an unacceptable risk, at least right now. At the bare minimum, we have to do a lot more research to figure out if and how and even if we can mine these things safely without wrecking the ocean the way that we've wrecked the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
That said, of course, there are a bunch of companies and a bunch of governments that are just licking their chops, drooling over the prospect of all the money to be made by hauling these things to the surface. It's already like there's a would-be industry already there. They've already sent a bunch of robot miners, experimental robot miners, to the bottom to dig these things up. They've shown that it can be done, and they're pushing really hard to be given permission from the United Nations, essentially, to get it. So far, nobody is allowed to do it, but that may change as soon as in the next year or two. So that's one to keep an eye on. Up here on the land, so we're getting these metals. We get them from all over the world, most of them, in ways of varying badness. I mean, mining causes damage. No getting around that, right? The whole idea, the whole goal is to strip away, forests and topsoil and blast apart rock and dig big holes in the ground and rip stuff out of the earth. The whole goal is destruction. So that said, we absolutely need mining. We cannot have modern civilization without mining. We have to accept we're going to do some damage if we're going to keep modern civilization, which I think is a good idea. Mm-hmm. But again, we can minimize it a lot. How can we do that? So cobalt is one that comes up a lot. 70% of all the cobalt in the world comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the poorest, most corrupt, most miserable countries in the world. So you can imagine, a lot of that cobalt is mined under absolutely horrific conditions. People are terribly exploited, working for, a couple of dollars a day, literally risking their lives in these crudely dug pits that can collapse on them at any moment. There's also thousands and thousands of children working in those mines. So it's a huge problem. And that's probably the one that's gotten the most attention out of any of the metals we're talking about. And all the electronics manufacturers and the car manufacturers are aware of this. They know it's a terrible look for them. And so their response has been mostly to try to get out of the business of buying cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Or if they do, to say that they're auditing their mines and that their mines are up to international standards and So that makes sense on a certain level, right? You don't want to support these terrible industries. But the problem, again, because there's always costs with things, the problem is if the whole world stops buying cobalt from the DRC, where does that leave the hundreds of thousands of miners who make their livings from cobalt? These are, some of the poorest people in the world who depend on this mining for their livelihood. The reason there's children working there is because their families need that extra income. So I think a much better solution is, rather than saying, oh my God, these mines are terrible, let's go somewhere else, a better solution, difficult but not impossible, is let's try to work together with folks on the ground there to bring those mines up to international, to proper environmental and labor standards. And let's make sure that the people working there get paid a decent wage. That's a solution we can all live with, right? There's cobalt mining in Australia too, but you don't hear about that because they follow environmental regulations. They pay their miners well. Nobody's worried about that. Let's try to do that for Congo. So that's one part of this. That's one idea. Then there's also, there are less damaging ways to actually extract the metals that we need, hopefully. So one of the places that I think looks really promising is in Southern California, there's a place called the Salton Sea. Maybe you've heard about it. It's not too far from Coachella. All right. Underneath the Salton Sea is a huge lake of lithium. It's basically these brines, these underground lake of water that's thick with salt and also minerals, including lithium. And there are a couple of startups that are working on what could be a really great way, or much less harmful way to extract that lithium than basically what's happening anywhere else in the world. The idea is, so this lithium brine is really, really hot. And we've actually been tapping it for a while to get geothermal power, right? There's a few companies in there that are using the heat to generate geothermal power, which is fine. The idea here is you use that geothermal power to pull that brine up to the surface, extract the lithium using sort of chemical techniques, different experimental techniques they're trying to develop, pull the lithium out, and then still using that, zero carbon geothermal energy, pump that brine right back down into the ground so that you're not losing any water underground. This, if they can get it to work, this could be a really, really efficient and relatively clean way to get a lot of the lithium that we need. So, like I said, there's a couple of startups that are working on it right now. They're getting quite a bunch of support from California state government. They were getting it from the federal government under the Biden administration. We'll see what happens when Trump comes back. But that's a good example, I think, of a sort of novel approach to extraction that can do a lot less harm.
Well, I want to let our listeners know that your book, Power Metal, The Race for the Resources That Will Shape the Future, is now available at booksellers everywhere. And while I will say the first few chapters can be pretty depressing in the sense that really making you rethink all of the choices that maybe you thought, like I did, were pretty virtuous, but actually have this pretty significant environmental and, as you mentioned, social cost when you think about the kids in these cobalt mines and, the people in Lagos working under such terrible conditions. But then I also feel like there is a real message, a pathway, as you mentioned, reduce, reuse, recycle, but also this support of these companies that are looking at ways of either extracting more environmentally or socially friendly ways, or using other materials. And I hope that we maybe even leverage some of the ability of AI to help us generate some new solutions for some of these very big problems that this electro-digital revolution, as you call it, is causing. So, Vince, thank you so much for being on Inquiring Minds.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And indeed, I kind of deliberately structured the book that way. The first half, all problems, all the, depressing, the usual journalism stuff. Second half is hopefully all solutions or possible solutions. So I want people to walk away from it feeling like there is hope. There is a lot that we can do to make things better, because there really, really is.
Great.
And if I could just get in one final plug, if folks are interested in these issues, I also have a weekly newsletter, also called Power Metal. It's at powermetal.substack.com, where I sort of, it's sort of like ongoing, up-to-date news about all the stuff that we've been talking about.
That's really great to hear, because as you mentioned, there are so many new things coming down the pike, like this new legislation in California and so on. So it'd be really great to keep up to date with what you're finding. So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank our long-term supporters, David Noel, Herring Chang, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, and Charles Blyle. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viskontas. See you next time.